This wasn't how I imagined it when we were starting out. I dreamed of money, cars, women, respect, freedom. I guess I ended up getting all that, more or less. But along with it came prison, living in constant fear, and the blood of my friends. I ducked it as long as I could, but it was finally catching up with me. It was all just a matter of time.
Vito Scaletta's early years were marked by hardship, poverty, and a disillusionment with honest work. Vito was born in the year of 1925 in Sicily, Italy, but as Benito Mussolini's influence began to grow in the country, his parents decided it was best to immigrate to the United States, where they would settle in the city of Empire Bay and find a dirty, dingy little apartment in the neighborhood of Little Italy. Vito's father, Antonio Scaletta, made the move to provide a better life for his family while avoiding the troubles brought with the country's new outlook and its complicated politics. In the grand scheme of things, it seemed like the best move, but it would still raise many new hurdles, not just for the family but the small boy Vito. Here in Empire Bay, Vito was captivated by the city's sights and sounds. It was unlike anything he had witnessed or experienced in Sicily. However, his new apartment and neighborhood they settled in were far from ideal. It was dirty, disgusting, and infested with rats. It wasn't the American dream, but it did offer a fresh start and some promising opportunities for the family. Vito would attend school to learn English, where he befriended Joe Barbaro, who would become his lifelong friend. And it looked as if everything was getting along quite well in the new country. Learning his new language and understanding the culture was something he would do fairly well at. But as with many people when they begin to grow up, Vito would really see the trouble his family was in. He began to realize his father, who quickly found work at the docks through the man who facilitated their immigration to the United States, was earning meager wages there. He struggled to make the simplest of ends meet, and any spare money he did manage to scrape together went toward his increasing dependence on alcohol. It was during this time Vito would begin to look at his father as a good-for-nothing drunk, a man who did just enough to say he took care of his family, when all that meant was tossing his wife and 2 children a few extra pennies. As Vito matured, he would look for jobs to help his family, but opportunities for honest work were slim to none in the poor neighborhood he was in. There was nothing, if anything at all, for boys his age from his neighborhood to get into in order to help their families out. So together with Joe Barbaro, they would venture into small-scale petty crime to earn just a little bit of cash. One night, while attempting to rob a jewelry store, they were confronted by a police officer, leading to a chase. Joe would manage to escape, but Vito was apprehended.
Throw me to bed! Stop! I wanna shoot!
Shit.
Okay, you bastard. Spread your legs.
Fuck.
Now put your hands on the fence.
I'm sorry, Vito.
The year was 1943. The world was caught in the grips of World War II, and the United States was actively recruiting for military service. Here at just 18 years old and fluent in Italian, Vito was the perfect candidate. Since this was his first time running into any sort of trouble with the law, he was given an offer: serve jail time or serve his new country. He would opt for the latter and would soon find himself serving under Operation Husky, the invasion of Italy. Vito's time in the service would be quite transformative, to say the least, especially his time in Italy, where he witnessed the power of the Mafia firsthand. After being briefly knocked unconscious from a tank shell, Vito would awaken to Italian soldiers executing survivors from both the United States Army and the Italian resistance. As one of these soldiers walks up to him and is about to kill him, the soldier stopped and called over to see an American tank with the head of the Sicilian Mafia, Don Carlo, hanging out of the tank's hatch, and he's calling for the entire Italian army to put down their arms. To Vito's amazement, they would listen to him. An entire garrison of men who numerically held a decisive advantage willingly and completely surrendered, all because Don Carlo simply told them to. For Vito, a man who was coincidentally saved from death by the power of this man, and of course having his own hated background of being poor and in a position of being incapable of helping others, this would all reinforce his own personal drive to not be like his father, to be a burden, not only to himself but the ones he loved and are supposed to be taken care of by him. This isn't a memory called up on again past the game's introduction, but it is one that will definitely stick with him upon his return home from the military. And it's a memory that his best friend Joe would immediately begin to remind him of, pushing him down a path of doing anything and everything he could to avoid being poor again.
A few years later, the Nazis put a bullet in me. I was in the hospital for a bit, then I got a month's leave so I could go home. At least for a little while.
A few years later, in 1945, Vito's allowed to return home from the military on a temporary medical leave. Vito had gotten shot in Europe and was allowed to return home for some time, with a plan originally being to see his mom and sister, then head back to the service with hopes of permanently returning home once the war in Europe is officially concluded. Plans would somewhat change when Joe unexpectedly surprises Vito at the train station. It's a touching reunion. The two haven't seen each other in years, yet it's clear their friendship hasn't faded in the slightest. Joe would invite Vito out to the bar as a way for the two of them to catch up before Vito heads home, and Vito would accept the offer. It's important to talk about Joe's time in Empire Bay here while Vito was off serving in the military, as his connections will become vital in what Vito decides to do in terms of making money. Joe had his own negative view on honest work. During the time Vito was gone, Joe would come in contact with men like Giuseppe, an arms dealer, master safe cracker, and counterfeiter, or men like Derek Papalardo, the man who ran the docks and had his own connections to Empire Bay's crime families. And then there was Henry Tomasino, a loyal soldier and respected hitman for the Clemente crime family. Joe would call in a favor to Giuseppe to help secure some forged discharge papers for Vito, allowing him to permanently stay home. Well, the name Joe has earned for himself working for the petty crime scene would help Vito secure a better job with Derek or Mr. Papalardo, who was initially going to have Vito working the same backbreaking honest work his father was doing, something Vito would begrudgingly give a 5-minute shot at due to his mother's behest, who didn't want to see Vito get into more trouble, especially tied to Joe, who, as far as she was concerned, was responsible for Vito getting in trouble with the law to begin with. But here, thanks to Joe vouching for Vito, Derek would offer him a position strong-arming the local workers into paying a fee for the barber, whether if they needed to have a haircut or not. All these connections his best friend Joe had created wouldn't just give Vito an opportunity, an open line to some powerful men and lucrative opportunities, it would also breed some envy and a little bit of an out for a desperate situation. Joe was living comfortably in his own fully furnished apartment with his own telephone, while Vito was expected to live on a measly $20 a week government allowance, living in his mother's crammed apartment. Not only was Vito in a bad position himself, but his mother and sister were worse than he knew. His father, who is now deceased, had created a debt of $2,000 or roughly 30 grand in today's money. With Antonio Scaletta dead, his debt was to be assumed by his wife and daughter, who were expected to pay before the week's over, or else the debt would go up again. Hating the position he's in now, envious of what Joe has, and reminded of the bad his good-for-nothing father did, Vito would begin to utilize the help Joe would provide. Aside from Giuseppe and leveraging Joe's name at the docks with Derek, Vito would be introduced to Mike Brewski, a man who owns a scrap yard and is always willing to pay for stolen vehicles. And then there was Henry Tomasino, who worked directly for the Clemente crime family. The Clemente crime family was one of 3 that runs Empire Bay, with Henry being Vito and Joe's connection with them. Now, to make sure Vito and Joe were up to this proper line of work, Henry would task Vito with stealing some gasoline stamps that were locked up in a safe inside the federal building of the Office of Price Administration. Thanks to the shortage on gasoline from the war effort, these stamps were to be worth a fortune, and this could be Vito's perfect opportunity to show to the crime family that he could in fact be useful to them. Vito would manage to secure the gas cards, no problem, but the issue here was they would expire at midnight. Henry instructs Vito to sell them before midnight or else he gets nothing. Vito, yet again proving his worth, would manage to get them off his hands, which in turn secures him a follow-up job. This time, Henry informs both Joe and Vito that a man has opened up a jewelry store with the funding provided by the Clemente crime family, who has yet to receive any form of payment from him. Henry instructs Vito and Joe to secure the money owed to them by robbing the jewelry store of its gems. And of course, they would be paid very handsomely on top of it. The pair would set out, successfully pick the locks to the front door, get inside the store, and begin lifting some jewels, but as they were starting to do so, they would get interrupted when a car ran straight through the store's window. Brian O'Neill, leader of the O'Neill gang, apparently had the same idea of robbing this jewelry store. It's evident he and Joe had some sort of history, as words are exchanged between the two of them, but the tension between the two is short-lived as police quickly arrive on the scene. Both Vito and Joe would manage to escape successfully, occasionally engaging in some minor gunfire between the police, but they will get the gems back to the Clemente family, while O'Neill and his accomplices were taken into custody. Yet another job well done, a job that was only going to get ramped up from here. With Vito securing the money from the stolen gasoline stamps and escaping the police from a jewelry store heist with the gems in hand, the next move was now to conduct a hit. Here they'd be officially introduced to Luca Guarino, a capo in the Clemente crime family. He'd congratulate the pair on their good work and tell them the next step is to deal with someone that's causing the family issues. If they can successfully kill this man and pay the small initiation fee of $5,000 each, they just might be able to be inducted into the family. Guarino would then slyly tell them being a made man was never cheap, but the cost is far outweighed by the benefits. He leaves the details for Henry to share with the two of them. Henry would inform the pair that the target is a crooked businessman formerly working with the Clemente family named Sidney Penn. Henry has already rented out an apartment across from his business. They're going to wait on the second floor with an MG42, and when Sidney shows up, they'll gun down every one of them from their elevated position. Vito is tasked with picking up the MG42 from the black market weapons dealer named Harry and is meant to meet the other two at the apartment. It's here, while the trio wait for Sidney to show up, that they get to know Henry a little better. Similar to Vito's own personal story, Henry's from Sicily. He came to the States after Mussolini came to power though, and he claims his father sent him and landed him a job for Clemente in an attempt to avoid him being drafted into the Italian army. Sadly, his father wouldn't be able to make the trip to the United States. Henry would claim that he was arrested by Mussolini and would die in a jail cell in Italy. Vito would then ask how Henry's English is so good if all of this is the case, but is quickly interrupted by Sidney's arrival. Here, all of Sidney's men would be gunned down, but he would escape inside, forcing the trio to hunt him down. A chaotic gunfight would ensue inside Sidney's distillery, until he's finally cornered by Henry. Henry would give the famous line of Don Clemente sends his regards when he's shot by Sidney. And this gives us one of the coldest execution scenes in this game, with Joe and Vito lighting Sidney up.
Don Clemente sends his regards.
Oh! Fuck! Fuck you, sorry you...
The intensity is also lifted a little bit with Joe being a smartass and Henry yelling at him. Henry would be taken to El Greco to be patched up, but before he's left into the doctor's custody, he pays Vito $2,000 for another job well done. Vito would quickly head over to his mother's apartment and hand his sister all the money he's earned to pay back the loan shark that has been bothering his mother and sister since the death of his father. His sister naturally is a little worried where he managed to get all this money from. This entire time, both his mother and sister were very wary to tell him any information about the bad position they were in, concerned that he would do things that he would regret, returning to a life of crime or doing anything illegal, the very thing that got him sent off to the military to begin with. And that's not to mention his mother still thought he was working honestly for Derek down at the docks, who was also covering for Vito at this time, claiming Vito was his own personal assistant. Nonetheless, Vito would give his sister a kiss goodbye and reassure her not to worry. Everything is fine. Give the loan shark the money and leave it as it was. Don't ask any more questions. Everything is okay. He would return home later that night, excited about the future. He's been home for less than a full week at this point and has already made enough money to clear his father's debt. Sure, he was personally broke yet again, and in some ways he's back at square one, but at least he had contacts such as Derek, Luca Guarino, and Henry Tomasino, and he showed all of these men that he can be quite useful to every single one of them. As far as he saw it from this point forward, he can only go up. But unfortunately for him, in under a week, everything would come crumbling down. One of the gas station attendants he sold the gasoline stamps to would end up ratting him out. The police would head to Vito's mother's house, demanding she tell them where he was, and eventually she would give in to the pressure, telling the police Vito was staying at his friend Joe's. Vito would be taken into custody, walking outside of Joe's apartment, but the police didn't understand the full picture. All they knew was Vito had stolen some ration cards, ignorant to the fact Vito did it for the Clemente family. Regardless, Vito wasn't going to snitch or give the police any sort of information. Besides that not being within his character, he still held out hope that he could in fact be inducted into the Clemente family, so it was in his best interest to just not share any bit of information. So he would face the criminal charges brought up against him, with Henry scraping together a lawyer that would be provided courtesy of his boss Alberto Clemente. Sadly, it appears even the lawyer couldn't do anything. It was all in vain. 3 months later, After Vito's initial arrest, he would be sent to a 10-year prison sentence that he was going to be serving in Hartman Penitentiary. Vito was home for under a month. In that time, he quickly made a name for himself. He helped his family get out of a very bad situation and was making moves to ensure they were better off than they ever were. Getting wrapped in trouble would cause him to be sent away from his family for yet a very long period of time, but in prison, it's here where he would really learn how the families worked and how they operated, splitting up the entire city of Empire Bay. He would come out as more experienced, better informed, better connected to the crime family's dealings, which he would use immediately upon his release from prison.
I can't believe that cocksucker Garino's still breathing.
What was your deal with him?
Well, you know, we did a couple jobs for him, and, Luca said he'd bring us into the family for, $5,000.
What? Typical fucking Alberto. He's always been a crooked bastard.
So what is that, like more than usual?
Yeah, like $5,000 more than usual.
You don't gotta pay to get in, Vito. You're brought into the family once you prove that you're loyal, a good earner, and you can handle, you know, the life. In any case, this is an interesting piece of news.
Vito was locked away for around 6 to 7 out of the 10 years he was handed. He wouldn't be released until the year of 1951. It's an entirely different world he was released into. Cars were different, fashion was different, his own personal family was different. While Vito was incarcerated serving his time in prison, he would learn his sister was getting married, and his mother was very sick. Vito would tell his sister to get the rest of his money from Joe, who was holding on to it for him, to buy the best doctor money could afford for their mother, and then use whatever was left over for a wedding gift for her. It wasn't exactly much, but it was the most he can do. It was still the best heartfelt gesture he can extend to his sister, while also doing whatever it took to ensure his mother got better while he was locked away. Sadly, these good intentions were all in vain as their mom would pass away, with all of Vito's money going to the funeral and her burial, leaving nothing for his sister's wedding. When Vito would eventually get released in 1951, despite being broke, having lost his mother and technically his sister who is now living the marital life, there was still the opportunity and connections he formed in prison. You see, during his stint, Vito would become a fighter and under the protection of Leo Galante. Galante was a consigliere of Frank Vinci, the head of one of the other crime families running Empire Bay. Leo and Vito would develop a father-son-like relationship, and that's something that will stay with Vito for the rest of his life. Leo essentially took care of him. Of course, it wasn't for free. Vito did prove his worth by holding his own, winning multiple fights, essentially getting Leo rich in prison, and he would also kill Brian O'Neill. As luck would have it, after he got arrested, the night he attempted to rob the jewelry store, he was sent here to Hartman Penitentiary, and he was the prime fighter that was giving Leo Galante's fighters trouble. He wasn't Vito's to take care of. He was Leo's main fighter, Pepe, to deal with until Pepe was beat up by Irish prisoners and they broke his arm. So Vito would have to step in and fight O'Neill. During the fight, O'Neill would pull out a shank on Vito, who would in turn use the knife back and kill Brian O'Neill, officially ending him as any sort of problem. Proving his effectiveness to Leo time after time and now showing he has the capacity to kill, Leo would promise Vito a spot in the Vinci crime family along with a time adjustment to his sentence once Leo is free within these coming months. Leo would also be the one to explain to Vito just how the families work and that the $5,000 buy-in fee Luca Guarino told him and Joe about was all a bold-faced lie. And the lawyer Clemente supposedly hired to keep Vito out of prison was most likely just there to make sure Vito never snitched. Whatever the case, Leo saw the worth Vito had and would provide that time adjustment that he promised, almost knocking off a full 4 years off of Vito's sentence. However, that position of working with the Vinci crime family never came to fruition, because at the end of the day, Vito and Joe were still looking out for each other. They were still best friends. Leo was aware of their friendship, and he was also aware that Joe had stopped working for the Clemente crime family and had fell in with the Falcone crime family instead, the last of the three running Empire Bay. Leo was well known and respected across all three families, so he had the pull to endorse that Vito get inducted into the Falcone crime family the same time Joe did. It was a favor he would do as part of their friendship that they had formed in prison. Joe and Vito would be accepted into the Falcone family as made men, but first, there was a series of small jobs they would have to do. First, they would have to help Eddie Scarpa, the underboss of Carlo Falcone, bury a body that he had rotting away in his trunk for 2 days, and now he was too drunk to take care of it himself. A few days later, the pair would be tasked with offloading some stolen cigarettes, dealing with some local greasers that would end up burning their entire supply of stolen merchandise, and finally, Carlo Falcone would personally meet with Vito and inform him that he believes the Clemente crime family is making moves against them. He questions Vito's feelings on Luca Guarino and Alberto Clemente, which Vito says after being left to rot in prison and of course them trying to steal $5,000 from him, he has no love for either one of them. With war looming on the horizon between the two families, that's precisely what Carlo wanted to hear. He leaves Eddie to fill him in on the details of trailing Luca, who is believed to have kidnapped 3 of Falcone's men who are missing. One of these men missing is Carlo's personal accountant. If the details of Falcone's family's dealings were leaked, they'd all be screwed. Vito would trail Luca to a slaughterhouse, confirm Falcone's missing men were in fact taken by Luca, and confronts him. A firefight would erupt between Vito and Luca's men, with it all ending in the death of Luca Guarino.
I'm gonna have a little fun with Luca before I grind him up. Wanna join me?
Thanks for the invitation, but I think I'll
Hate
pass
to
on
say
that.
blood, huh?
No, just hate the sight of Luca.
I hear you, but you're missing out. I think I'm gonna try out that cattle prod he was yapping about.
Vito managed to save Falcone's accountant and the secrets kept within the books while putting down a rival family's underboss. Carlo, Vito, and Joe would celebrate later that night with the 2 men being initiated into the Falcone crime family. It was an initiation that was made even more special with the presence of Don Frank Vinci and the man who made this all possible for Vito, Leo Galante. For the next few weeks, Vito and Joe would thrive in their new positions as made men. Vito would buy his own house in the neighborhood he had always wanted to move into, finally getting out of a shitty apartment or couch surfing at Joe's apartment. He'd be able to buy his own car, and it looked as if everything was going great for him. Long gone were the days of being poor or struggling to figure out where he's going to sleep, how he's going to eat, or where he's going to get clean clothes from. While he and Joe were enjoying their newfound fortune, behind the scenes, the two families were beginning to prepare for war. About a month after the death of Luca Guarino, Alberto Clemente has called a meeting with all of his top men up in the Arms Hotel. Since Vito had proof of Luca kidnapping, torturing, and killing at least one of Carlo's men, Falcone can justify any action he takes openly against the Clemente family to all the other crime families. Alberto knows this, so it's just a matter of who's going to strike who first, and this is where Vito and Joe come in. Carlo wants the 2 of them to take Alberto out once and for all, and they're gonna do it at this meeting that he's called at the Arms Hotel. Apparently Joe has worked out all the finer details. Joe's plan is to plant a bomb inside the room Alberto's in while he and Vito overwatch the meeting from a window washing platform. When the time is right, the 2 of them can blow it from there. How they're going to get inside the hotel was also taken care of. Joe secured a contact that works at the hotel that'll let them in through the laundry room, where they can also secure some janitor uniforms to get past all of the armed security. Oh, and for an added layer of protecting their identities so that way they're not made later on, he has Vito wear a fake mustache.
Vito, one more thing. Here, put this on.
Are you fucking serious?
So nobody recognizes us. Just put it on.
Great.
This is something Henry would later comment about as he does pass by Vito and Joe on their way inside the hotel, completely disregarding that the 2 of them are probably there to kill his boss and everyone else inside. In order to cover their escape route, or just in case a chase would end up bleeding over into the main streets, Joe also recruited the help of a friend by the name of Marty. Marty was a kid that Joe has been more or less looking out for. He helped take care of the greasers who had burned up the cigarette supply some time before, but he wasn't expected to really be in danger here, nor was he a part of any particular crime family. He was simply being brought along because he was a good driver and Joe wanted to see the kid be taken care of. Through all the crap Vito and Joe would give each other as they make their way through the hotel, for the most part, Joe's plan would succeed. Joe would fasten the bomb underneath the table inside the room Clemente's meeting was taking place, so the janitor's uniforms definitely worked, which would also allow them to pretend to wash windows without arousing suspicion while they kept a close eye on what was going on inside of the room, picking the perfect time to blow the bomb. Really, everything was going well. The only issue this time was the wire for the bomb was too short. When it came time to detonate the bomb from a safe distance to safety on the rooftop, the wire was just too short, and as the platform began to ascend, it would prematurely detonate the bomb. This would kill everyone in the room except for Alberto Clemente, who happened to be in the restroom.
What the?
Shit.
Christ, I almost pissed on my fucking shoes in
What a
here.
fucking mess.
Felt like a fucking earth, but what the fuck? Oh, shit!
Lucky bastard.
You assholes! You're gonna die for this! Get away! Come on, Vito!
He was just as surprised to see Joe and Vito as they were to see him. Clemente would begin to flee, and now it was time for the pair to chase him down. They would kill every one of Clemente's men, chasing him all the way to the hotel's parking structure where Marty was supposed to be waiting with the car running. To Joe's horror, Marty was found out and he was killed. Joe would be deeply affected by Marty's passing. When Vito eventually catches up to Clemente's car, Joe would vengefully unleash an entire magazine from his Tommy gun into Clemente and his driver's body.
This is for Marty. Now it's over. Let's go to my place.
It doesn't end here though. For the next few days, we would see Vito being placed in a very trying situation, testing his loyalty, what he values most, and what he believes in as a person. Not only does he have to help out Joe, who's struggling to come to terms with the death of Marty, which led to him blowing up at both Vito and Eddie, going to a bar and accidentally killing the bar's owner. It's a murder that Vito would have to basically cover up for his best friend. But the following day, Henry would pay Vito a visit at his house. Since Alberto's now gone, Henry is out of work. He comes to Vito as a friend, asking he put in a good word for both Eddie and Carlo so he can come work for the Falcone family. Despite not really even having any sort of contact with Henry since the days of Vito and Joe working for Alberto, Clemente, and Luca Guarino, who left Vito out to dry, Henry, in Vito and Joe's eyes, was a good guy. He knew the ins and outs of this business, he was a professional hitman, and at the end of the day, he was still considered to be a valued friend by both Vito and Joe. Vito never really seen Henry having any hand in Vito getting arrested or him and Joe being tricked out of $5,000. So as a favor for a friend, Vito would in fact go to Eddie Scarpa and put in a good word for Henry. Vito's proved his value and loyalty to the Falcone crime family, and his best friend Joe has as well, so their word was solid. Eddie would invite Vito to introduce him to Henry, which for both Henry and for Eddie, the timing couldn't have been more perfect. As it turns out, Falcone has his own suspicions that Frank Vinci, head of the Vinci crime family, is now also making moves against Falcone. There's no concrete evidence to really justify the suspicion, but what has been turning up is enough to warrant a genuine cause for concern. Falcone does expect being hit by Vinci, the question is just when and where. Since Henry has worked directly under the Clemente crime family, Eddie would ask him if he knew any information about Clemente trying his best to convince Vinci to make moves against Falcone. Henry would disclose that he was in fact with Luca Guarino one time at Leo Galante's house, where Luca would claim that Falcone was selling dope, and Clemente and Vinci should do something about it before it gets out of hand. Everyone in the city knows that there's many opportunities in the criminal world to make money. Frank has one rule when it comes to making money, and that is do not get involved with selling drugs. He's passionately against that. With the claim of Falcone selling drugs being brought up to Frank, that would in turn motivate him to turn against Falcone. With this revelation, Eddie now knew what had to be done. Frank Vinci's right-hand man had to be taken out. Without his consigliere, he'd be lost and stuck in the water. And if Henry wanted to join the Falcone crime family, he already got his blessing by Vito, he just had to prove his worth. It's his job to take out Vinci's consigliere. If he can do that, he's inducted into the family. When it comes to Eddie, it's actually a win-win situation. There's no proof Henry's working for Falcone. If he fails, then it just looks like a failed random hit. There's no concrete evidence Falcone sent him to do his dirty work. If he succeeds, then it's a massive blow to the Vinci family, and Henry's now a made man yet again. The problem here is the consigliere of the Vinci family is Leo Galante, who Vito still has a very high amount of love and respect for. Eddie understood this. He'd asked Vito to tag along with Henry to make sure it all went smoothly, but if he can't, Eddie understands. In place of Vito, Henry can take some guys he trusts for the extra help, and Vito could head home. Not one to stand aside and forget all Leo's done for him, Vito would directly go against the family he's working for, drive to Leo's house, and warn him a hitman is coming. At first, Leo would be completely unfazed, almost as if he's seen this all coming. Leo would share Carlo is in fact in the drug business, everyone knows that. The reason why he and Clemente basically went to war was because Clemente was muscling his way into the business, and now, with him taken out, Carlo set his sights on Vinci before he made moves against Carlo. Regardless, why leave with Vito when the two of them can just take care of the hitmen themselves? They have the element of surprise after all. Vito would reject this plan. He would much rather help Leo escape than to turn around and kill his friend who he basically got the job to kill Leo. Ultimately, none of it really matters because Henry would discover Vito here with Leo. The three of them will basically sit down and discuss the position they were all in. Henry can't let Leo go. If he does, it'll look like he let him escape, painting him as a failure and possibly costing the one chance he has at being a made man again. Leo admits he's an old man, and while he admires Vito sticking his neck out for him, it was a very stupid move for him to jeopardize everything just to buy an old man a few extra years, if that. Leo would accept his fate as the nature of the business, and both he and Henry would apologize to Vito, who opts to wait outside the door while Henry completes his contract.
You owe me big for this one, pal.
What?
Hey, kid,
Leo.
you want a drink?
In a twist of events, while Vito's outside the door mourning the death of the man who served as his only respected father figure, Henry would come out from the room and tell Vito he owes him big. Henry and Leo had actually settled a deal after all. The deal was Leo would disappear, take a train to Lost Heaven, and leave all this business behind. Henry, on the other hand, would never share Vito was ever at Leo's and would still be inducted into the Falcone family despite it being known Leo wasn't actually killed. While these events do play a hand in the bigger picture much later in the game, I find everything Vito has done here is a testament to his character. He risked everything: the money, the power, the respect, the protection of the Falcone family, all that he worked for his entire life. He was more than willing to throw away to save the person who, in his own eyes, made it possible for him to even be in the position that he was in. Leo was unlike anybody else Vito had ever come to have in his life. The thought of losing him was massive. Vito was visibly shaking, nervously smoking on a cigarette, knowing that on the other side of that door, the only father figure he ever had would be killed, and despite everything he's obtained for himself, he was in a hopeless position. Financially, he was sound, but physically, his hands were ultimately tied. In the end, Leo would be taken to the train station by Vito, who's much more content with watching him leave, not really knowing what happens to him after, rather than knowing he was killed, especially by someone who he basically helped get that contract. With Leo gone, the crisis of Vito's family being attacked at every angle isn't exactly over just yet. Vito would return to his house to find his sister Francesca crying at his front door. Vito hasn't seen his sister in some time, as she's been living with her husband, who, as it turns out, has been cheating on her and even been putting his hands on her. Vito understandably would become enraged at this revelation. He would track down her husband at a party while he was filling up on some random woman. Vito would angrily attack him and threaten him if he ever touches his little sister again, he'll personally finish him off himself. He then demands that he returns home to his sister and walks a straight and narrow path. He better become the most faithful person to walk planet Earth. It's an action I think many people would do the same if they ever find themselves in a similar position. Even if they don't, it's hard to argue against Vito's case, but to his sister, seeing her husband beaten and seeing the quote-unquote monster Vito has become, this action would lead to her directly cutting him off, effectively limiting his family to just Joe now.
My house burned to the ground, along with almost every penny I had. There was even some trouble with the cops, but Eddie took care of that. And since I didn't have any insurance, I had to live in this shithole of an apartment till I could get back on my feet. At least I managed to save Leo. He disappeared without a trace. I doubt Frank Vinci even knew where he went.
Vito's misfortunes wouldn't end with his sister though. What remained of the Irish gang, formerly led by Brian O'Neill, is now ran by his cousin, Mickey Desmond. Mickey's trying to solidify his position as head of the Irish gang, and he would do this by attempting to kill Vito by burning his house down while he slept. This would just backfire, with Vito and Joe turning up at the gang's new hideout, killing everyone there, and finally ending the Irish presence within the city. With Vito's house burned down, all his money and clothes gone, he was right back at square one though. Losing everything he had, Joe would allow him to stay at Marty's dirty apartment while he did his best to sell it off for Marty's mom. Being poor, just as he was many times before, before, only now feeling so much worse since he's still technically a made man. He felt, as he put it, like a poor wharf rat, just like his old man. Luckily for him, or perhaps unfortunately for him, an opportunity would come up in just a few days. And I say it's unfortunate because this is one of the major decisions that would be a massive mistake for Joe and Vito. It would be one of the major factors that would contribute to Vito basically being branded as a dead man walking.
Listen, I've been doing some research into Carlo's business.
So?
So, the only reason he had Clemente killed was because he was selling dope too, and he was stealing his customers.
Where'd you get all this?
I talked to a few people I trust.
Okay. So what does this have to do with us?
'Cause if he can do it, why can't we?
Henry now wanted to get into the dope game. He meets up with Vito and Joe, where he confirms what Leo had shared with Vito earlier, that Carlo Falcone was indeed selling drugs. Alberto Clemente was stealing his customers, and that's what actually triggered the war between the two of them. Clemente's gone, Falcone is focused on dealing with Vinci, who's the one person keeping him from being the city's one and only drug supplier. So Henry figures that while Falcone is focused on Vinci, he, Vito, and Joe could establish their own connections within the drug trade. He sees it as quick and extremely lucrative money for just moving a few shipments from point A to point B. Henry puts out this entire plan, trying to convince both of them that he's basically did all the legwork and all the calculations. He secured drugs from the Chinese triads, who are too threatening or foreign for many people in the city to deal with, so the trio would be the middleman between the triads and local buyers. Henry's already talked to the Chinese, who are willing to give him 10 kilos of heroin to start off with. Henry, Vito, and Joe would just need $35,000 to buy the 10 kilos, which Henry says can then turn around and be sold for a profit of $110,000. It's all well and good, but the trio don't have 35 grand to pull together, especially with Vito's current situation, so Henry proposes the idea of heading to a loan shark named Bruno that he knows would be willing to loan him the money. Bruno would agree to give the trio 35 grand in $20 bills, but they have to pay him back a promised 55 grand by Friday. For every week the debt isn't fully paid, it goes up an additional $10,000. The three of them would agree, take the cash to the Chinese triads, and buy the agreed 10 kilos of heroin. As they were walking out with the drugs in hand, some men pretending to be police officers would stop them and ask if they had something for them. Henry, having a keen eye for how these men were particularly dressed, he would point out that they aren't real cops, resulting in a gunfight. The Chinese factory would ultimately be destroyed as a result of the firefight between the illegitimate cops, Vito, Joe, and Henry. And they would of course leave a trail of bodies behind, but the three of them would then continue with the original plan, selling the dope to a few various buyers around the city. They'd buy some new suits, grab some girls, and celebrate a job well done. It's a premature celebration though. Just a few days after the initial deal with the Chinese would go down, Carlo Falcone would find out about their venture into the drug trade. Now, Henry originally told Joe and Vito that if Carlo found out, that he would just demand a cut and would leave them alone, which is all Carlo wanted. He would send Eddie to Henry to collect his cut of $60,000. It's an amount that was way too steep and way too abrupt, since they don't even have the money to pay back the loan shark Bruno his $55,000 to begin with, let alone an additional $60,000 on top of that to kick Falcone his cut. Henry would tell Vito and Joe to meet him at the park where they can figure out what to do next. The entire drive there, Vito and Joe are completely unsure on what to do. This was really Henry's venture after all. He was the plan maker, and from the sounds of it, he was the one that had all the money still. Vito and Joe were completely in the dark. They had no idea if Carlo was aware they were partnered with Henry, what they were going to do next, how they were going to manage to get the money for Bruno. It was just all pushed to the side until they can meet up with Henry at the park, and hopefully he can be the one to pull some type of plan or has some idea of what to do next. Unfortunately for the both of them though, their situation would only go from bad to worse.
Henry's different these days. The guy's got a real...
What the fuck's going on?
Shit, that's Henry! What the fuck are they hitting him with?
Joe and Vito would catch the Chinese taking whatever money Henry had come to the park with, and they were in the middle of assassinating him. Enraged by this betrayal, the pair would immediately take out any Chinese triads here within the park. Vito would catch a glimpse of Mr. Wong leaving the park in a vehicle. Mr. Wong was the one to originally sell them the heroin, and it was no accident that he was here in broad daylight overwatching Henry be butchered to death. He would have some explaining to do, along with repaying them with the money he stole from Henry. Vito and Joe would trail his car, leading them to the Red Dragon restaurant in Chinatown. They were deep inside enemy territory. This was the Triad's turf. Joe was in no mood to negotiate or have any exchange of words with the people responsible for the death of his friend. They all deserved to die. Vito, on the other hand, was thinking much more logically. While he did agree with Joe, it was better to not go guns blazing, bringing everyone down on top of them, at least not immediately. As they walk into the restaurant, all logic and reason immediately went out the window as soon as Joe opened fire, though. The two would proceed to kill every single person in their path as vengeance for their friend. After putting down scores of men, they'd find Mr. Wong in his office, who, after being interrogated by them, would inform the two of them that the Chinese informant inside the Federal Bureau of Narcotics informed them that Henry Tomasino was a government informant, and he had passed information about their drug deal to the feds. Henry was a rat, and he died the way that he did for being a snitch. Vito and Joe denied their friend would ever do such a thing. They would then demand where the money is that they took from Henry, as they still needed to pay off both Bruno and Carlo, but Mr. Wong refuses to cooperate, so Joe just angrily kills him.
So where's our money?
It's not here anymore.
What?
Where the hell is it then?
I cannot tell you.
If you don't tell us, I'm gonna splatter your yellow brains all over this fucking room.
If I told you, I'd be dead anyway.
Fine, your choice.
Are you crazy?
What you want to do? Let him go or something?
We could have gotten more out of him.
Fuck that. He wouldn't have said nothing. These bastards are tough.
With Henry dead, no money to pay back Bruno or Carlo, who they still aren't even entirely sure was aware they were working with Henry, and now all the men that they slaughtered in Chinatown potentially looking as if it was an attack blessed by Carlo Falcone himself. They were up Shit's Creek without a paddle. Their circle was rapidly closing with no way out. They only had each other to trust. Finally, having a small moment to rest, they would decide paying back the money they owe Bruno would be their main priority. Luckily for them, Eddie Scarpa would hand them a hit job as a favor for another Mafia family in a nearby city. The hit was worth a few grand, and all they had to do was kill someone who ratted on their own family back in the city of Lost Heaven. They've been looking for this guy who's been in protective custody for years, but now they finally found him, and it was time to pay him back. For those that had played the first game, this hit was on Thomas Angelo, who snitched on the entire Salieri crime family in order to save his wife, daughter, and of course his own skin. It's interesting how in the context of Tommy's story, it's a conclusion to how you never really escape your past. The life you lived, the things you've done, especially as a made man, to then turn your back on it all, it doesn't end in a glamorous way. Or with you disappearing into the sunset, there is no happy ending here. It all catches up to you. In the context of Vito's story, he's taking out someone who betrayed the code. He's a snitch. There's no love lost for his kind, nor does Vito have the luxury to even feel for him. He desperately needs the money. He's created a mountain of problems for himself. His decision to get into the dope game can easily be perceived as a traitorous move to Falcone. Meanwhile, he's struggling to do his best to not end up just as his father was, digging himself deeper and deeper into a level of debt that he can never hope to pull himself out of. It's an easy job, quick money, and a desperate position. Once the hit is done, Joe and Vito would then split up, looking for various jobs to come up with in order to scrape together their own split of the money they owe Bruno. Vito's way of attempting to gather his own cash would be to head down to the docks, pay his father's owed employer Derek a visit, and see what's going on. Luckily for Vito, Derek does actually have the perfect job for him, and it's quite simple. He offers Vito $1,000 to just help him passively aggressively coerce the dock workers to shut up and get back to work. They're threatening to hold a strike over someone that Derek had just recently fired. He's not expected to do anything other than just stand there and look menacing. Simple enough and straight to the point, until Derek says Vito's name.
You're Scaletta's boy, ain't ya? Your dad used to talk about you all the time. You look just like him. But what are you doing working for this bastard? After what he did to your old
Shut
man?
your fucking mouth right now. Don't listen to him, Vito. He's full of shit. Come on, let's go.
Full of shit, huh? That bastard killed your father, Vito. What?
They're just trying to get under your skin.
Derek?
Hey, stop pointing that gun
Why
at
don't
me.
you ask him how your dad drowned that night?
As it turns out, Derek and his assistant Steve were responsible for the death of Antonio Scaletta. Vito's been unknowingly friendly and at times even working for his father's killer. Vito would now turn his sights on Derek and Steve, eventually killing them and raising complete hell at the docks while doing so. For Vito, killing Derek and Steve was great in many ways. It wasn't just about avenging his father, it was more so payback for the hell his mother went through as a result of the abhorrent financial situation Antonio was put in, forced to work a backbreaking job for pennies on the dollar while then being killed with an open debt for his wife to assume. It was just problem after problem that was placed on his mother's shoulders to deal with. Sure, his father might have been irresponsible, but at its core it could be argued many of his problems stemmed from Derek. Regardless, with Derek and Steve killed, Vito would raid Derek's office and would come up with almost $30,000 to repay Bruno's debt. Immediately coming up with his half of the money and finding out his father was actually murdered by someone at one point in time he would consider a friend, it was definitely an intense afternoon for Vito, but now with his half of the owed $55,000 in hand, Vito would head to Joe's place to see how his friend has fared in getting his half of the money together. Vito would wait for hours outside of Joe's apartment with no sign of Joe around. With it getting late, Vito was starting to fear the worst, so he would begin to go out and look for his best friend. He'd start with Eddie, who claims he hasn't seen Joe, but he does share Henry was killed by the Chinese. Henry has gotten into the drug trade in the triads, something he knew was expressly forbidden, but Eddie does share with Vito that Henry was given a pass by Carlo so long as he paid Carlo a small fee. Evidently, things went south as now Henry's dead, but Eddie mentions that clearly Henry wasn't working alone. Whoever he was partnered with attacked the Chinese, leaving dozens of bodies all over Chinatown. The Chinese are already beginning to threaten both the Vinci and Falcone crime families, with war brewing. Tension is building all across the city and fast, and there seems to be no logical reason behind who or what exactly is going on. Eddie would question Vito's knowledge on the situation, to which Vito would just plead ignorance. He and Joe have been together hanging out for the past few days, doing their own thing. Yes, Henry did invite Vito as part of some type of business venture, but Vito says that he passed on it and that was it. If Vito and Joe feared what Carlo would do if he knew about their involvement in Henry's plan to begin with, now with Vito lying directly to Eddie's face and tensions continuing to rise all across the city between the Italian and Chinese gangs, Vito's fate was essentially sealed here. From here, Vito would then head to Giuseppe's to see if Joe had come by the old man's workshop and look for work. Giuseppe would confirm that he did in fact see Joe, and the two of them were ironing out some details for a job that Joe could complete for him, but their conversation was cut short when some of Frank Vinci's men came and took Joe. According to Giuseppe, Vinci's men said that Don Vinci himself wanted to have a word with Joe, so they took him. He has no idea where exactly they went, but he can start at Vinci's bar named the Mona Lisa. On the one hand, it's great that Vito was finally able to make some sort of progress in tracking his best friend down. However, Joe and Vito were not in Vinci's good graces, especially since Vinci is still very angry over the whole Leo business. He essentially lost his advisor and best friend. Now he's being threatened by the Chinese, and Carlo's making moves against him, and he's stuck in the middle between what appears to be a very quickly growing two-front war, and so he would take Joe as a way to find some sort of answer to what the hell's going on. Joe would be beaten, tied up, shot, anything Frank could do to get the information out of him that he wanted. Joe would play dumb just as Vito would, who came to rescue his friend but would just end up in the same spot Joe was, tied up to a pipe. Frank Vinci would appear and question both of his captives, who would just only upset him as they refused to share any information Frank knows they are in possession of, as there's no way in hell he can lose a grip on the city so rapidly as he seems to have. No matter, Frank would leave them tied up on the roof of the bar under the supervision of his men. After being knocked out, Vito would eventually come to a few hours later, where he and Joe would break free and repeat the same thing they did at Chinatown and massacre every one of Frank's men. They would then secure a car where Vito would take Joe to El Greco to get patched up. While Joe was tending to his wounds, Vito would then take the full $55,000 they had and deliver it to Bruno. This would give them at least one of the many problems they have off of their back. In typical fashion, Bruno would toy with Vito and Henry being dead, or how their venture must have been a success, as Vito did deliver on the $55,000, but he does find it odd that everyone is coincidentally at each other's throats, around the same time that Henry asked for the loan. Just as before, Vito would play ignorant on what Bruno was talking about, the loan is completely separate and has no ties to the current state of the city. Vito would begin to leave when Bruno would ask him what his name was.
Scaletta. I knew a Scaletta once. But I must say, you're much better at paying back your debts than he was. His poor wife had to do it for him.
So it was you who lent my father the money.
Your father. Ah, like father, like son. I see you don't approve. But I didn't make him borrow the money, now did I? Just like I didn't make you. If you ever need a loan, you know where to find me.
Just as Derek was his father's killer, Bruno was the loan shark responsible for his father's debt. I think this highlights that no matter what your intentions are or how much better you believe yourself to be than the person who failed miserably before you, you never really know exactly who you're dealing with. Had Vito never shared his full name here, he'd never know Bruno had such a major impact on his family. You never really know who you're dealing with or just how ignorant your loved ones, let alone you, can be when it comes to a life you thought would bring you all the things you could ever want. Almost from the start, Vito was just a kid who loathed being poor so much, hated the failure that his father was, that he saw an out, but he didn't realize the people that controlled and managed that out were the same ones that helped his father fall into the pitfalls that he did. Vito would return home that night and reflect on everything. His father, his mother, his upbringing, how everything could have gone so horribly wrong. He wanted power, influence, money, girls, success. Well, he did taste it very briefly. It's a life he couldn't control. He broke the rules, warning Leo. He broke the rules by getting into the drug business and then lying about it. He and Joe basically started a war between the two Italian families and the Chinese. And he also made a major mistake that'll guarantee him being marked for death by Carlo Falcone, Frank Vinci, and the rest of the commission. Everything would come crumbling down on him the next day.
Yeah, hello.
Vito. Yeah, it's Eddie. Listen, I need you to...
Let me guess. You need me to come by right away, and I should bring a gun.
For once, I don't. Carlo wants to see you over at the planetarium.
Did he say what it was about?
Nope. Better head over there now, though. Don't want to keep the man waiting. Yeah, see you, Vito.
Carlo wanted a word with Vito. He didn't need a gun, and he was allegedly waiting at the planetarium for Vito. The latter would be a blatant lie. Carlo wanted Vito dead. He found out the truth. Everyone did. As Vito was preparing to go meet with Carlo at the planetarium, Vito would be forced into a vehicle outside of his house. Leo was inside. He returned to Empire Bay after some time hiding, but it wasn't good news. Inside the car with Leo was Mr. Chu, leader of the Chinese. Leo shares half of Vinci's men are dead, half of Mr. Chu's men are dead. They know Vito and Joe are responsible for both sides losing so much men. The two of them started a war, and to top it off, Vito vouched for Henry to be inducted into the Falcone crime family. Henry was confirmed to indeed be a rat. Mr. Chu's men killed Henry because he was a snitch, and Vito responded by killing his men. Now that Henry was killed, who was a government informant, the feds are cracking down on Carlo and everyone else involved. Vito is to be blamed for it all. Frank, Mr. Chu, Carlo, and the whole commission want Vito dead. He's causing too much trouble for them, and he vouched for a rat. Leo says that he would have been taken care of a long time ago. The only reason he's still breathing is thanks to the love and respect that Leo has from everyone. Leo came up with an option that somewhat satisfied all parties involved. Carlo is a problem. The feds are prioritizing him. If Vito can step in and kill Carlo, the commission won't exactly forgive Vito, but they will spare him death. Vito has no choice. He has to take care of Carlo here and now, who's actually held up at his observatory. He knows that Frank Vinci and Mr. Chu is going to make some type of move. He just doesn't know who's coming or when they're coming. Vito is to be the one to take care of it all. If he refuses, he dies. Not really having any sort of choice, Vito would do as he's told. He'd make his way over to the observatory where some of Carlo's men would stop Vito at the front, saying they need to take his weapons before he speaks with the boss, who is still expecting him. Vito would respond by opening fire. He would then proceed to kill every single one of Carlo's men until he eventually finds Carlo at the heart of the observatory. Carlo would laugh at the insult Vinci and Chu gave him by sending Vito alone to do their dirty work. He says Vito has no sense of honor or loyalty. He vouched for a rat and will die because of that. And it's Joe's job to take him out.
But your buddy Joe understands, don't you, Joe?
What the fuck is this?
I could ask you the same question.
Loyalty's a funny thing, huh, Vito? No such thing as friendship in this business. Didn't your old pal Leo teach you that while you're sucking his cock back in the can?
It's interesting to think that Carlo decided to spare Joe and forgive his involvement in the whole drug move on top of helping Vito start a war with the Chinese. in defense of Henry. I guess since Joe wasn't a part of vouching for Henry to begin with, everything else was forgiven, and he was even offered a reward. If he managed to kill Vito for Carlo, Joe would be made a capo within the Falcone crime family. He'd be given his own crew and truly achieve the heights of power he always wanted. All he has to do is take out his former best friend. Carlo would try his hardest to try to get Joe to turn on Vito, but in the end, the two of them would put their former boss down.
You know something, Carlo? For the last 10 years, all I done was kill. I killed for my country. I killed for my family. I killed anybody that got in my way. But this one's for me. Fuck you. Fucking prick.
They'd exit the observatory together where Leo was waiting with a bunch of armed men. Vito would confirm Carlo Falcone is in fact dead, and Leo would respond with the celebration at a cat house, asking Vito to ride with him so they can continue to talk business and what the next move between the two of them would be. Joe would ride in a separate car. This would be the last time Vito would ever see his best friend. The car Joe was in would take an unexpected turn, with Leo telling Vito Joe was never part of their deal. Vito had no time to worry about his friend, whose fate would end up largely unknown to him for what seems like the rest of his life. But for now, he has to answer to the commission for the punishment of killing the Triads. As part of the deal Leo Galante has worked out with the commission, Vito Scaletta would be spared death, but he's exiled from Empire Bay. He'd be sent south to the city of New Bordeaux. Luckily for him, he'd still be considered a made man working for the Marcano crime family. Eventually, there would be trouble between Sal Marcano and Vito, as the two of them never actually seen eye to eye, and Sal only accepted Vito as a lieutenant under his watch out of the respect that he too had for Leo Galante. But he would still eventually try to get rid of Vito when Lincoln Clay would step in and save Vito's life.
Looks like I got here just in time, Vito.
Lincoln, how's this possible? I thought you were dead.
Bullet was deflected by my skull. Came out the back.
Talk about some goddamn luck.
Worst place to shoot a fella's in the forehead. Skull's harder than you think. Come on, we need to have a talk.
There's no official canon on whether if Vito is officially killed by Lincoln or if he becomes the one to rule New Bordeaux. After the death of Sal Marcano and the Marcano crime family is officially deposed within the city. What is known is through it all, Vito lost every bit of family he ever had. Joe's fate is largely a mystery to him, although he believes he was killed. Leo left him down in New Bordeaux, even though he did spare him a meeting with the Grim Reaper, and his sister disowned him, terrified of what he became. Vito made a vow to himself as a kid he would never be broke or poor ever again. And while he technically still did obtain that, he lost all the family he ever had in the process.